October 26, 1943. A railway siding in the bush north of Dauphin, Manitoba. The train has been slowing for 10 minutes, and inside the cattle car, the air is cold enough to see. 23 German prisoners stand pressed against the wooden slats, and not one of them moves toward the door. Corporal Willi Schneider is 24 years old. 11 months ago, he was crouched behind a gun south of El Alamein, with the rest of the Afrika Korps, the desert sun cooking the back of his neck. Now his boots are frozen to the floor of a Canadian boxcar, and his breath is fogging the iron bolts. The train stops, the bolt slides back. The door rolls open, and white winter light pours in across 40 exhausted faces. A Canadian sergeant stands in the snow with a clipboard. He does not shout, he does not raise a rifle. He looks up, almost bored, and says, "Out you come. Bring your kit if you've got it." Willie jumps down. His boots punch through the crust of snow. And then he stops, because something is wrong with what he is seeing. Or rather, something is missing from it. He had spent 8 days bracing for the towers, the double fences, the floodlights, and the wire. He had lived behind all of it for 10 months already, and the men around him had lived behind it longer. He turns a slow circle in the snow, looking for the thing every prisoner expects to see first. There is no fence, no towers, no wire, nothing but barracks, a cookhouse, a thread of smoke, and beyond it, mile after mile of black pine running to a pale horizon. For a man who had been taught that walls were the entire shape of the world, that empty white tree line was more frightening than any rifle barrel. And the truth he was about to learn over the next 2 years out there, past the trees, in the lamplit kitchens of strangers, would change something inside him that no barbed wire ever could. Before we go further into the woods at Whitewater Lake, take 1 second to subscribe. This channel tells the forgotten human stories of the Second World War, the strange decisions, the quiet mercies, and the men on both sides who discovered who they really were, far from the front. It costs nothing, it takes a second, and it helps these stories reach the people who would never otherwise hear them. Now, back to the snow and the camp with no walls. To understand why 40 hardened German soldiers stood frozen in a field at the sight of open ground, you have to understand the place they had just come from. And to understand that, you have to go back to the desert. Willi Schneider had surrendered in North Africa. By the late autumn of 1942, the Afrika Korps, the force that had carried Rommel's name across 1,000 miles of sand, was finished. It was being crushed between the British 8th Army, pushing west, and the Americans landing in the rear. Tens of thousands of German soldiers walked out of the dunes with their hands raised over their heads. Some were taken at the Second Battle of El Alamein in October and November of 1942. The great mass of the rest went into captivity in May 1943, when the whole position in Tunisia collapsed, and roughly 250,000 Axis troops surrendered in a matter of days. For Willie, it had ended on a ridge of gravel and thorn scrub, with the water gone and the ammunition gone, and a British officer walking toward his position with a pistol he never needed to draw. He had expected to be shot. Instead, he was handed water and a cigarette and pointed toward a column of men shuffling east into a prison cage. He was 23 years old, and he assumed the war was simply over for him and that the worst was behind him. He was one of an almost unimaginable number. When Tunisia fell, the prisoner haul was so enormous that the Allies barely knew what to do with it. The cages on the coast overflowed. Men sat in the open sun for days waiting to be counted, processed, and moved. An army that had once threatened to take Cairo and the Suez Canal had become a logistics problem. Hundreds of thousands of mouths to feed in a theater where every drop of water and every tin of food had to be hauled across the desert. The British did not want them in Egypt. They did not want them in Britain, where a German invasion was still, on paper, a thing to be feared, and where every spare building was already spoken for. The prisoners had to go somewhere far away, somewhere safe, somewhere vast. They had to go to Canada. The worst, in truth, lay a long way ahead, though not in the shape he feared. They marched the prisoners to the coast and packed them into ships. These were freighters that had hauled war material across the Atlantic to Britain and were sailing back to North America with empty holds, and the Allies filled those holds with prisoners. It was a strange, dangerous voyage. German U-boats still prowled the North Atlantic in 1943, hunting anything that floated. But the U-boat crews knew those particular ships often carried German prisoners home and tended to let them pass. Willie spent the crossing in a steel hold that stank of bilge and fear, listening to the engines and wondering whether one of his own Navy's torpedoes was about to send him to the bottom of an ocean he had never wanted to cross. They made landfall at Halifax, and then began the part of the journey that broke something open in nearly every man who endured it, the train across Canada. By the middle of the war, Canada had become one of the great holding pens of the entire Allied prisoner system. The country eventually took in tens of thousands of German prisoners, more than 30,000 of them, and scattered them across a chain of camps that ran from the Atlantic provinces to the prairies to the forests of Ontario. It was a strange burden for a young nation to carry. These were not Canada's prisoners, exactly. Most had surrendered to the British in a desert on the other side of the world. But Canada had two things Britain desperately lacked in 1943: room and safety. An ocean stood between these men and any hope of rejoining the war. They could be put to useful work. And if a few of them slipped a fence, there was simply nowhere on the continent for them to go. It went on for days. The prisoners pressed their faces to the windows and watched a country unspool that simply refused to end. Forest, then lake, then granite. Then west of the lakehead, the prairie, flat and endless, and white gold. A horizon so far away that grown soldiers fell silent looking at it. Many of these men came from the close, walled, ancient landscape of Germany, where the next town was always just over the next hill. Here, there was no next town. There was only distance, on and on, until distance itself became the thing they feared most. A man could feel, watching that country slide past the glass, that escape here was not a matter of cutting a wire. It was a matter of crossing a continent on foot, in winter, with no papers and no language, and a face that did not belong. The Canadians were counting on exactly that feeling. They were about to build it into the design of a camp. But first, Willie went to Medicine Hat. Camp 132 in southern Alberta was a machine built to crush the very idea of escape before it could form, and the numbers alone were meant to do the crushing. The camp sprawled across roughly 50 hectares of bald prairie. It was designed to hold 12,500 prisoners, more men than lived in many of the towns nearby. There were 36 two-story barracks, each one packed with around 350 men sleeping in double bunks. There was a mess hall, workshops, an education hut, a hospital, a dental clinic, and a morgue. It was an entire German city set down on the Canadian plain, and every inch of it was sealed. The ceiling came in layers. First, an inner strand of warning wire ran about a foot off the ground. Low, almost casually, cross it without permission. Ignore the guards shouted warning, and the next thing you heard was a rifle. Beyond the warning wire stood 2 full layers of barbed wire fence, lit all night by floodlights that turned the snow a hard blue-white. And over all of it, 22 guard towers, manned around the clock by the Veterans Guard of Canada. That was the entire shape of Willie's world for 10 months. The wire, the light, the tower, the rifle. He learned to measure his life in the distance between fences. And there was a second kind of terror at Medicine Hat, one that had nothing to do with the Canadians and everything to do with his own countrymen. Inside the wire, a hard core of committed Nazis had quietly seized control of the prisoners' lives. They held their own secret courts. They drew up their own lists. They decided who was a loyal German and who was a defeatist, a coward, a traitor, and being judged a traitor inside that wire could get a man killed. In the summer of 1943, a prisoner named August Plaschek was murdered by fellow Germans inside the camp. The following year, a former university professor turned Luftwaffe interpreter, Dr. Karl Lehmann, whose only crime was telling other prisoners the plain truth that Germany was losing the war, was lured into a hut and killed on September 10, 1944. The barbed wire kept the prisoners in. It did nothing whatsoever to protect them from each other. This was the thing the newsreels never explained about a prisoner of war camp. The danger did not always wear the enemy's uniform. A man could survive 2 years of British shells in the desert, survive a torpedo-haunted crossing of the Atlantic, survive the cold and the wire and the floodlights, and still lie awake at night in his bunk wondering whether the man 3 beds down had decided he had said the wrong thing, looked too long at a Canadian guard, smiled at the wrong moment. The fanatics ran the barracks like a small occupied country. They enforced the salute, they punished doubt. And the older, tireder men, the ones who had simply wanted to go home since the moment they put their hands up in Africa, learned to keep their faces blank and their opinions buried. The wire around Medicine Hat held 12,000 men. A good many of them were prisoners twice over, once of the Canadians and once of their own side. So when the order came in, October 1943, 440 men, pack your kit, you are going by train to a place called Riding Mountain. Willie did not know whether he was being rewarded or condemned. No one did. A rumor ran down the barracks that it was a punishment detail, brutal labor in the deep bush. Another rumor said it was a soft posting in the country. Both rumors agreed on one thing only. Wherever they were going, it would have a fence because everywhere had a fence. The reason behind the transfer had nothing to do with the prisoners at all. It was about firewood. That sounds almost comic now. In the winter of 1942 and 1943, it was a genuine national emergency. Nearly 1 in 2 Canadian households still heated their homes by burning cordwood. And the war had stripped the country of the men who cut it. The loggers, the bush crews, the strong young backs were all in uniform, in England, in Italy, in the air over Germany. The trees were still standing in the forests. There was simply no one left to fell them. A hard winter with no fuel could kill civilians in their own homes, as surely as any bombing raid. So the federal departments of labor and national defense looked at the labor shortage and then looked at the 34,000 enemy prisoners they were already feeding, clothing and guarding at vast expense, and they did the arithmetic that every government does eventually. The prisoners would cut the wood. The place chosen for one of these labor projects was Whitewater Lake, in the heart of Riding Mountain National Park, roughly 300 kilometers northwest of Winnipeg, near the town of Dauphin. The Parks Bureau was no stranger to work camps. It had run them in Canada's national parks for nearly 30 years, enemy aliens in the First World War, relief workers through the Depression, others besides. Those men had built roads and lodges and handsome stone and log buildings, all in the name of developing the parks for tourists. But the camp the Bureau built at Whitewater in 1943 was unlike anything it had ever attempted, and the difference was the entire point of the thing. They spent roughly $250,000 on it, serious money, in 1943. There were 6 large bunkhouses, each one fitted with its own washroom and shower facilities, a hospital, a kitchen and mess hall, a recreation hall, a garage, stables and a barn, and a small power plant that the prisoners themselves would learn to run. The camp had electricity, running water, and a sewer system. By the standards of a wartime work camp anywhere on Earth, it was very nearly comfortable, and there was no fence, no towers, no floodlights, no coils of wire on the perimeter. The boundary of the entire camp was marked by nothing more than axe blazes, pale scars cut into the bark of a ring of outlying trees. Step past the blazed trees, and you were technically out of bounds. There was nothing physical on this earth to stop you from taking that step. The men who designed it that way were not fools. They had a theory, and the theory was confident to the point of arrogance. The wilderness itself would be the wall, a wall far higher and far colder than any wire. The camp sat in the dead center of a country of forest, muskeg and lake. The nearest rail line out was distant. Winter ran hard from November to April, with cold that could kill an unprepared man in a single night, and snow that erased every trail by morning. The nearest friendly soldier was on the far side of an ocean. Where exactly was a man supposed to go? On a map in an office in the east, the logic was airtight. Draw a circle around Riding Mountain, and what surrounds it is hundreds of miles of bush in every direction. No German army within 5,000 miles. No neutral border a man could realistically reach on foot. No city where a stranger with an accent and no papers could disappear. The planners looked at that map and saw a prison whose walls were made of geography, and geography, unlike wire, never rusts, never needs a guard, and never sleeps. They were so taken with the idea that they wrote it down as policy. A fence, they reasoned, would cost money and serve no purpose the wilderness did not already serve for free. There was a second, quieter calculation behind the open camp, and it was shrewd. Officials believed that a man with no fence to resent might work harder than a man behind one. Strip away the wall, and you strip away the thing for a prisoner to push against. Give a man the illusion of freedom, and he may forget to test the limits of it. The lack of fencing, the planners wrote, would serve as an inducement to the men to work. To watch over 440 enemy soldiers in this open camp, there were roughly 75 guards, a mix of civilian staff and military men. The soldiers belonged to the Veterans Guard of Canada, older men, most of them veterans of the First World War, judged too old to be sent overseas to fight a second one. They carried rifles. They had no machine guns. They were, by and large, steady and unhurried men, fathers and grandfathers who held no special hatred for the Germans and every intention of getting through this war quietly and going home to their own. There was one last thing, and the prisoners came to hate it more than the cold or the labor. To make a wandering man easy to spot against the snow, the camp dressed every prisoner in blue denim, work clothes with a wide red stripe running down the outer leg of the trousers, and a single large red circle stitched onto the back of every shirt and every jacket. Willie pulled his on the first morning. He felt the other's eyes go to the bright red ring between his shoulder blades, and he felt his own eyes drawn to theirs. It unsettled the men in a way the weather never managed. A red circle on your back, out in open country, where any farmer in the district could see you coming across a field a quarter-mile off. It felt less like a uniform than a bullseye. One of the older men said aloud what they were all thinking. They have painted a target on us, he muttered, and given us no fence to hide behind. Willie would come to understand, slowly, that the red circle was the only fence the Canadians believed they needed. And he would come to understand something stranger and far more human than that. Out here, in this enormous and confident country, almost no one was aiming at it. The work began the morning after they arrived, and it was punishing. Each man was handed an axe, a Swede saw, and a number, 3/4 of a cord of cut and stacked firewood, every single day. 8-hour days, 6 days a week. For desert soldiers who had spent 2 years in the sand, and then 10 months going soft behind wire, the first weeks in the Manitoba bush were a particular kind of education. The saw blade bound and screamed in the frozen wood. The cold came straight through the denim as if it were paper. Sweat froze in a man's eyebrows. Hands split open inside thin gloves, and the splits did not heal. At the end of the day, the men staggered back to the bunkhouses and fell into their bunks like the dead. A cord of wood is a stack 4 feet high, 4 feet deep, and 8 feet long. 3/4 of that felled and limbed and bucked and split and stacked by one man with hand tools, in snow up to his thighs, in a cold that turned spit to ice before it hit the ground. That was the daily measure of a man's worth at Whitewater. They were paid 50 cents for it. The arithmetic of the place was simple and merciless. The country needed wood, the men were here, and the trees were not going to cut themselves. There were no machines worth the name. There was only the axe, the saw, the man, and the daylight, which in a Manitoba December ran terribly short. In those first weeks, almost no one made the quota. Some men simply could not. They had never swung an axe in their lives, and some would not. The hardest of the pro-Nazi prisoners regarded cutting firewood for the enemy as treason against the Reich, and they did everything in their power to slow the work to a crawl, leaning on their saws, dulling tools, fouling the count. The camp authorities dealt with that quietly and efficiently. They identified the worst of the troublemakers, marched them onto a truck, and shipped them straight back to the wire and the towers at Medicine Hat. The lesson was not lost on anyone who stayed. Production climbed, but it was what happened after the 8 hours that would matter to history. When the saws went silent at the end of the working day, the men were, within the blazed ring of the camp, more or less free to do as they pleased. And then the Canadians did the thing that no German soldier on that train had thought possible. They began to trust them. The prisoners ran the camp's power plant themselves, with no Canadians standing over them. They were given regular access to horses and to trucks. Work details rode into the nearby town to help haul supplies. The reasoning was as blunt as it was correct, and the commandant said it plainly to his officers. This camp does not function without the cooperation of the prisoners. The math was undeniable. There were 440 of them and 75 guards, and a good share of those guards were grandfathers carrying First World War rifles. If the Germans collectively decided not to cooperate, there was not a thing the Veterans Guard could do to make them cut a single stick of wood. So the whole place ran on an unwritten bargain. We will treat you like men, you will behave like men, and for the most part, against every expectation it had. In the long, empty northern evenings, the men filled the hours the way soldiers always have. They argued the war back and forth across the bunkhouse stoves. They played scat and chess for matchsticks. The ones with a gift for it staged theatrical performances and musical evenings with costumes sewn from scrap and sets hammered together from offcuts of their own firewood, and for a few hours a bunkhouse would smell like a real theater and not like a logging camp. The craftsmen carved. They turned out boxes and toys and models of startling skill, and the most ambitious of them hollowed entire dugout canoes out of single logs and paddled them on Whitewater Lake in the brief warm weeks of the northern summer. They kept pets too. Stray dogs took up residence and were fed from the mess. And in the spring, the men found and raised an orphaned black bear cub, which became the unofficial mascot of a camp full of soldiers 18 months before had been firing artillery at British tanks in the African desert. Someone photographed the cub in a prisoner's arms. The photograph survives to this day, and it is one of the strangest images the war ever produced. Hard Afrika Korps veterans in a forest in the middle of Canada, cradling a baby bear. There is something almost unbearably human in all of it. These were not soft men. They had crude guns and driven tanks and buried friends in the sand. They had lost a war, and now, set down in a quiet forest with their evenings their own, they did exactly what human beings have always done when you give them a roof, a stove, and a little time. They made a life. They built a stage and put on plays. They carved toys for children they had never met. They hollowed canoes and paddled a Manitoba lake in the short bright summer as if they were boys on a holiday. They adopted a bear. The war had taken almost everything from them. And in the gap it left behind, ordinary life crept quietly back in. The same ordinary life that was going on that very season in the farmhouses just beyond the blazed trees. And they shopped. This is one of the small, almost unbelievable truths of Whitewater Lake. The prisoners were paid 50 cents a day for their labor, and they were permitted to spend that money by ordering from the Eaton's Catalogue, the great Canadian mail-order wish book that landed at every farmhouse and homestead in the Dominion. Soldiers of the defeated Afrika Korps sat in the Manitoba bush and leafed through the same catalogue as the farm wives across the park boundary, ordering tools, pajamas, tobacco, and watches, and waiting for the parcels to arrive by truck. On one occasion, a batch of the men threatened to go on strike. The cause was not the labor, or the cold, or the war. It was that a shipment of pajamas they had ordered from Eaton's had failed to arrive on schedule, and they suspected the guards of having stolen the parcel. A near mutiny in a prisoner of war camp over missing mail-order pajamas. That was the texture of life at Whitewater. Picture it from the outside for a moment. Somewhere in Europe, that same winter, German and Allied soldiers were freezing in trenches and dying in burning tanks. And here, in a forest in Manitoba, a contingent of those same German soldiers was on the brink of downing tools, not over brutality, not over starvation, not over the conditions of their captivity, but because Eaton's was late with the pajamas. It would be funny if it were not also the clearest possible proof of how completely the ordinary had reasserted itself inside that fenceless camp. Men do not riot over pajamas in a place where they are afraid for their lives. They riot over pajamas in a place where life has become, against every expectation, almost normal. That detail of the catalogue seems harmless. It was, in fact, the seed of everything that came next, because the catalogue watches gave the men something to take apart. And a clever soldier, holding the works of a cheap watch and knowing the angle of the sun, can fashion a crude but workable compass, small enough to close inside a fist. A compass meant a man could walk a straight line through trackless bush in the dark and find his way home again before the morning count. The very catalogue that let the camp feel civilized was quietly handing the prisoners the one tool the wilderness wall had never accounted for. The first sign of trouble came fast, insultingly fast. 5 days. The prisoners arrived on October 26th, and on the morning of October 31st, 1943, the count came up short. 19 men were missing. 19. The camp held its breath. A mass break, 5 days in, would be a catastrophe. It would mean the immediate end of the whole experiment, the closure of Whitewater, and the shipment of every man back to the wire. The guards braced for the worst, and Lieutenant Mann's stomach dropped at the figure on the count sheet. And then, over the following hours, the missing men came wandering back in, cold, sheepish, in no particular hurry. They had a story, and it was the very same story that every man who ever pulled the trick would use for the next 2 years. They had simply gone for a walk, a hike in the woods. They had become turned around in the unfamiliar bush, lost track of the trail and the time, and here they were, terribly sorry, no harm done. There was nothing Lieutenant Mann could do about it, and that was the maddening shape of the whole thing from the very first week. The men had not escaped. They had returned of their own accord, before any alarm could be raised to the outside world. They had broken no fence, because there was no fence to break. They had crossed no wire, fired on no guard, struck no blow. They had gone for a walk in a national park and come home for supper. Try writing that up as a mass escape. Try explaining to headquarters in the East that 19 prisoners had vanished and then unvanished, all in an afternoon, with smiles and apologies and frozen boots. On the official count sheet, by nightfall, every man was present and accounted for. And a count sheet with no one missing is a count sheet that says, in the only language the army understood, that nothing has happened at all. The 19 had been testing the wall. And in 5 days they had learned what would take the authorities the better part of 2 years to admit, that the wall was not there. What those 19 men had discovered, in their first 5 days, was the great secret of the place. The wilderness was not an unbroken wall after all. It had seams. And along the southern boundary of the park, just past the blazed trees, lay the one thing the camp's confident planners had weighed far too lightly: people. The land just south of Riding Mountain had been settled decades earlier by waves of immigrants from Eastern Europe, Ukrainians above all, and others from the territories the Soviet Union had absorbed. They had carved small hard farms out of the bush in districts with names like Olha, Horod, and Sich. They were poor, isolated, devoutly hard-working, and they were, almost to a family, no friends of Moscow. Many of them nursed a bitter, complicated hope that a German army might one day break the Soviet grip on the homelands they had been driven from. So when young German soldiers began drifting out of the woods at night, a good number of these farmers did not see the enemy at the door. They saw lonely boys, far from their mothers, who happened to hate the same empire they did. It is worth sitting with how strange that was. The official story of the war, the one printed in the Winnipeg papers, broadcast on the radio, stamped on the recruiting posters, said that the German soldier was the enemy of everything these families had crossed an ocean to build. But the official story had been written for a different map than the one these settlers carried in their hearts. To a farmer whose parents had been starved or driven off their land by Soviet power, the great enemy was not the boy speaking broken English in his kitchen. The great enemy was far to the east, and that boy's army was the only force on earth then fighting it. Politics in that snowbound district did not run along the tidy lines drawn in Ottawa or London. It ran along older, deeper grievances that the war had done nothing to heal, and that, more than anything, is why the doors opened. And so, quietly, a traffic began. The prisoners learned the trails through the dark. They learned which farmhouse windows would show a welcoming lamp. Local farmers with horse-drawn sleighs took to waiting at the park boundary after nightfall, ready to collect the men and drive them off to a dance, or a wedding, or a card game in someone's warm kitchen. And this is the part that tells you everything. The farmers brought along a change of clothing, a borrowed coat, a borrowed cap. A young German in a farmer's mackinaw, with the red circle hidden under wool, looked like any other farm boy at a country dance. The single fence the Canadians had bothered to build, the red circle, came off with the jacket. The Germans, it turned out, made very welcome guests. They were polite and well-mannered. They could dance, and they arrived bearing the most valuable gift in a rationed countryside, sugar, which they drew from the camp's own stores and which the local farmers needed for the homemade stills that warmed every winter celebration in the district. A German prisoner who came to your dance with his pockets full of sugar was a friend worth keeping. Willie went out for the first time that first deep winter. 3 of them walked a compass line through the black trees, the dry snow squeaking under borrowed boots, the cold so sharp it lay against the cheek like the flat of a knife. He kept waiting for the searchlight that never came, the shout that never came, the shot that never came. There was only the dark and the breath of the men beside him, and then, far off, a single yellow lamp in a window. The door opened on a wall of heat, and the smell of wood smoke and frying onions. A farmer's wife stood there, saying something he could not understand in a language that was neither English nor German, and she pressed a tin cup of something hot and strong into his frozen hands, and pulled him inside out of the cold. There was a fiddle going in the next room. There were girls his own age. There were old men arguing politics in 3 languages, and a stove roaring, and the whole low, warm chaos of human life on a winter night. And Willie Schneider stood in that kitchen with a red circle hidden under a borrowed coat, and understood that he was, in the only way that counted that night, a free man. And he understood, too, that he would walk back to the camp before dawn. All of them would. Because the alternative, the wire, the towers, the secret courts at Medicine Hat, was so much worse than any open door. That was the whole genius of the thing, and the prisoners had worked it out for themselves long before any official noticed. Any real escape, a man who simply did not come back, would bring the entire arrangement crashing down on every one of them. It would mean the maximum security camp for the lot of them. So they policed themselves with an iron care no guard could have matched. They went out, they courted, they danced, they drank, and they were always back inside the blazed trees before the morning count. The fence was not in the wilderness, it was in their heads. They had built it there themselves, and it held tighter than any wire ever invented. And it held because every man understood the bargain in his bones, without anyone ever writing it down. The thing that made the open camp possible was not the cold and not the distance. It was the certainty, shared by all 440 of them, that the freedom was on loan and could be revoked in an instant by the foolishness of a single man. One real escape, one prisoner who walked into the trees and simply did not come back, and the experiment was finished. The trucks would come. The whole contingent would be loaded up and hauled back to Medicine Hat, back behind the double wire and the floodlights and the 22 towers, back into the reach of the secret courts. Every warm kitchen, every dance, every hour of borrowed, ordinary life would vanish, for everyone, forever. So the men guarded their fragile arrangement with a discipline the Veterans Guard could never have imposed from outside. They watched each other, they brought each other home. The hardest enforcement at Whitewater Lake was carried out not by the guards, but by the prisoners themselves, because the prisoners had more to lose. A locked camp is held shut by its guards. This one was held open by the people inside it. There was a price, though, and the men knew it, even as they ate the warm food and danced with the farm girls. Their freedom depended entirely on staying invisible. And in a thin scatter of farms across a frozen district, where every family knew every other family for 20 miles in every direction, nothing stayed invisible for long. The rumors began to move. Park prisoners seen at a dance in Olia, Germans drinking in Horrid, a polite young man with an odd accent at a kitchen table in Siege, whom nobody's cousin could quite place. The whispers traveled farmhouse to farmhouse, and eventually they traveled up to the camp, and they landed on the desk of the officer in charge of the Veterans Guard, a man named Lieutenant Mann. Mann was in an impossible position, and he understood it completely. By any ordinary military logic, he should have been able to crush this in a week, but the men were not, technically, escaping. They always came back. They were never reported missing at the count, because they were never once missing at the count. The internment authorities, reading the tidy paperwork from far away, flatly refused to classify the men as escapees. On paper, nothing whatsoever was happening at Whitewater Lake. Officially, it was the calmest camp in Canada. Mann telephoned the RCMP detachment down at Dauphin and asked for help. The Mounties listened to him politely and then declined to lift a finger. They would involve themselves, they explained, under two conditions only: if a prisoner were formally reported missing or if a civilian lodged a complaint. Neither was ever going to happen. The farmers were not complaining, they were the hosts. The camp was not reporting anyone missing. Every man came home. The system had a hole in it, exactly the shape of what was going on, and no one above Mann's rank seemed to care. So the lieutenant sat with a problem that officially did not exist, and he grew angry. Not loudly, steadily. He was the man responsible for 440 enemy soldiers in the middle of a war, and some of those soldiers were spending their nights in the homes and beds and dance halls of Canadian citizens, and every institution that should have backed him up was looking the other way and whistling. It ate at him through the long winter. By February of 1944, Lieutenant Mann had made up his mind. He would stop relying on the count, which lied to him. He would stop relying on the Mounties, who would not come. He would go out into the districts himself, at night, unannounced, with a hand-picked detail, and he would catch the prisoners in the act, in someone's house, with his own eyes, where no paperwork could explain it away. He chose his night carefully. Saturday, the 19th of February, 1944. Deep winter. There was a wedding in the district that weekend, which meant a dance, which meant Mann was certain the Germans would come out of the trees. What Lieutenant Mann did not know, and could not have known, was that the night he had chosen to enforce the war was about to collide head-on with the life of a 17-year-old schoolteacher who had nothing to do with any of it, and that the story which came out of that one snowbound evening would still be being told, in tears, down a long-distance telephone line more than half a century later. Her name was Catherine Chasko, and in the winter of 1944, she was 17 years old. She had never meant to be a teacher, but there was a war on, and rural Manitoba had simply run out of grown men to stand at the front of a classroom. The province was desperate enough to take almost anyone willing. So in the summer of 1943, with grade 11 barely behind her, Catherine was sent to Wesley College in Winnipeg, given a 6-week crash course in how to run a school, and then handed one of her own. It was the Zaporozhye School, a single-room schoolhouse about 15 miles north of her family's home near Shoal Lake, deep in the immigrant farm country along the southern edge of Riding Mountain. She boarded with a local farmer named Peter Krun, his wife Anne, and their 2 small daughters. Most of her pupils were the children of Eastern European immigrants, families much like her own. She was good with the children, and she liked the work, but she was 17, and a long way from home, and lonely in the particular way of a young person dropped alone among strangers. So when some local women her own age invited her to a Saturday dance over at Seiche in the new year, Catherine went, and at that dance she got the surprise of her young life. The hall was full of German prisoners of war. She went rigid. These were the enemy, the men the radio bulletins and the newsreels had taught her to be terrified of, the men her country was at war with, the men whose bombs and bullets filled the front pages of every paper. But the women on either side of her only laughed at the look on her face. There was nothing to fear, they told her. The Germans came to all the dances. They were polite, they were clean, they were good dancers, and they brought sugar. Everyone in the district knew. It was simply how things were, out here, beyond the park boundary. In a corner of the world the war had mostly forgotten. So Catherine Chasko danced in a country hall full of Afrika Korps soldiers and Ukrainian farm girls, while a war burned across an ocean, and nothing bad happened at all. A week later, on the night of February 19th, the war came and found her anyway. Peter and Anne Krun had a wedding dance to go to, about 2 miles off across the snow. They asked Catherine to stay home and mind their 2 little girls for the evening, and she agreed. The children were put to bed. The farmhouse went quiet around her. Outside, the snow began to come down hard. The heavy, soundless prairie snow that wipes the whole world clean and white and closes every road behind it. At around 10:30, there was a knock on the farmhouse door. Catherine opened it to find 2 German prisoners standing in the storm, snow piling on the shoulders of their coats. They were cold. They asked, with great politeness, whether they might step inside and warm themselves before going on their way. She hesitated. She was a 17-year-old girl, alone in the house with 2 sleeping children, and these were enemy soldiers on a winter night. Every sensible instinct told her to shut the door in their faces. But it was snowing hard, and they seemed gentle, and they were freezing. She let them in. They introduced themselves. Willie, Reinhard. They saw the jigsaw puzzle spread across the Trun's dining room table, half finished, and they offered shyly, in their broken English, to help with it. And so, while the snow fell, and a world war ground on across the ocean, a 17-year-old Canadian schoolteacher and 2 soldiers of the German Afrika Korps sat down together at a farmhouse table in the lamplight and quietly worked a jigsaw puzzle, searching for the straight-edge border pieces, turning the cardboard fragments over in the warm light, trying this one, then that one, finding the match, fitting it home. 3 young people, none of them much older than the others, all of them an enormous distance from where they were ever supposed to be, building one small picture together, piece by piece, in the middle of the night, in the middle of the war. It is one of the gentlest scenes the entire Second World War ever produced, and it lasted about an hour. No one in that lamplit room was thinking about the war. There was only the puzzle and the snow against the window, and the small companionable silence of 3 strangers doing a simple thing together. Whatever Willie and Reinhard had been on the battlefields of North Africa, in that hour they were only 2 cold young men who had found a warm room and a kind girl and a quiet task for their hands. Then came the second knock on the door. Harder this time. Official, it was Lieutenant Mann. He had come out of the storm with his detail, working the district farmhouse by farmhouse exactly as he had planned. And he had been led by someone out on the road that night who had told him precisely where to look, straight to the crumb place. The proof would be in the snow the next morning, footprints under the window. At least 2 people had been standing outside in the dark and the cold, watching the lamplit table through the frosted glass, watching the girl and the 2 Germans bent over the puzzle. Someone had whispered to Willie and Reinhard that the schoolteacher was alone and might welcome the company. And that same someone had then gone straight to the camp guards and told them exactly where the 2 men could be found. The prisoners had been set up, and so had she. Mann ordered the 2 Germans to their feet and out into the storm. The evening was over. Catherine, frightened to her core, began to cry. She told him the truth, that she had never invited these men, that she had laid eyes on them exactly once, a week before, at the dance at Siege, that she was only here to mind the children. Mann did not believe one word of it. In his official report, he wrote that the visit had plainly been prearranged, because the teacher had admitted she had met the men before. To a cold and furious lieutenant standing in a doorway at 11 o'clock at night, a single dance was proof enough of a conspiracy. He took his 2 prisoners and left her there. A 17-year-old girl weeping in a borrowed farmhouse, with 2 children asleep upstairs and a half-finished puzzle on the table. But Lieutenant Mann was not done for the night. He wanted to know what the Kruns themselves knew about their boarder and her German friends. So he drove the 2 miles through the storm to the wedding dance, walked in, and began to demand answers. It was the worst possible place and the worst possible moment. The wedding party had been celebrating for hours. The hall was packed. The men had been drinking hard. And into the middle of all that warmth and music walked a uniformed army officer demanding to know about prisoners of war. The mood turned in a heartbeat. There was shouting. There was shoving. Peter Krun stood toe-to-toe with the lieutenant and swore to his face that no prisoner had ever once visited the schoolteacher at his home. It very nearly came to blows. A near riot at a country wedding, in the snow, in the dark, set off over the question of whether 2 lonely young soldiers had any business helping a frightened girl finish a jigsaw puzzle. By the next morning, Mann's patrol had swept the district and rounded up 7 Germans. They were marched back inside the blazed trees and held under guard while the authorities worked out what on earth to do with them. And here, at last, is the thing the title promised. The payoff the camp's confident planners had never once accounted for in all their arithmetic about cold and distance. They had built a prison with no fence because they were certain the wilderness would make the men too frightened, too frozen, and too lost to ever leave, and the men had left anyway. Night after night, all winter long, they had walked out through the seams in the trees, and not one of them had run, not one had tried to escape the country. They had gone out to dance, to court, to sit at a kitchen table and help a terrified 17-year-old find the edges of a jigsaw puzzle so she would not have to sit out the snowstorm alone. The open camp produced not a single successful escape in 2 years. What it produced instead was the one thing a fence is built to prevent and can never truly contain: human connection. Ordinary contact leaking out through the gaps in the trees between people who had been told they were enemies and who had quietly decided, on their own, in the dark, that they were not. You take away the wall and you do not get chaos. You get a jigsaw puzzle on a farmhouse table at 10:30 on a snowing night. That is what they found, in the end, when they built a prison and forgot to build the prison. Morning after the raid, Catherine Chasko woke to find that her small world had quietly turned against her. The 7 captured prisoners were back behind the blazed trees, under guard, awaiting a decision. But the real damage rippled outward in every direction from that farmhouse. Lieutenant Mann, it turned out, had not driven straight back to camp after the wedding. He had taken a detour. He had gone to Shoal Lake, found Catherine's father, and complained to him directly and at length about his daughter's conduct. A man arriving in the night to tell a father that his 17-year-old girl had been entertaining the enemy, and the community, furious that an outsider's troubles had brought an army officer crashing into a wedding and nearly started a brawl, did the easiest and cruelest thing. They blamed the girl. She had ruined the dance. It was her fault. She was 17, alone, far from home, and now disgraced, for the crime of opening a door to 2 cold men in a snowstorm and helping them with a puzzle. It fell, in the end, to the Germans themselves to try to set it right. About 2 weeks later, in the dead of night, Willie and Reinhard came back to the Kron farmhouse one last time. They were risking a great deal to do it. Another night march, another roll of the dice against the Count, with the camp now watching the district far more closely than before. They asked to see Catherine, and they had brought her gifts, things they had made with their own hands in the long bunkhouse evenings, the patient handiwork of men with a whole winter to fill, a ship in a bottle, and a small hand-carved wooden box filled with chocolate bars, saved up from the canteen. They had come to apologize, as best 2 men could across the language that stood between them, for all the trouble they had brought down on her head. Then they walked back out into the dark, back along the compass line to the camp, and Catherine Chasko never saw either of them again. But the visits did not stop, because the men of Whitewater had decided, in their wordless way, to keep an eye on the girl they felt they had wronged. That April, a different prisoner knocked at the door of the Zaporozhye schoolhouse and asked, with enormous courtesy, whether he might simply sit at the back and watch her teach the children for a while. She let him. He sat quietly through the whole lesson, and at some point his eye fell on the classroom clock, which had stopped on the wall. He said nothing about it. He rose, lifted the clock down, and repaired it with the same patient skill some prisoner had once used to take apart an Eaton's catalogue watch and turn it into a compass. He hung it back on the wall, ticking again, and quietly let himself out. Sometime after that, Catherine opened the schoolhouse door to let the children out for recess and found yet another prisoner sitting on the steps. He got to his feet when he saw her, apologized for the intrusion, and went on his way down the road. That was the last of it. At the end of the school year, Catherine packed up and went home. To her great relief, her father, the man Lieutenant Mann had hunted down in the night, never once raised the incident with her. Not a single word. But her teaching days were finished, and she knew it without being told. That summer, she left Manitoba behind entirely, traveled east to Ontario, and took a job on an assembly line in a munitions factory building, with her own hands, the very weapons that were being fired at the countrymen of the 2 young men who had once helped her find the edges of a puzzle. The camp itself did not outlast her by much. By the spring of 1945, the fuelwood crisis had eased. The war in Europe was visibly grinding to its end, and the prisoners, bored to the bone after a year and a half of cutting the same trees, had begun deliberately slowing production to a crawl. It was the same quiet sabotage their hardliners had attempted at the very start, now adopted by ordinary men who simply wanted to go home. The government decided Whitewater had served its purpose. Fuelwood cutting stopped on March 31st, 1945. The remaining men were loaned out to local farmers for the summer harvest, and the camp was formally closed that autumn. Then the Parks Bureau did something that tells you exactly how the authorities felt about the whole strange experiment. They hired a Winnipeg wrecking firm and ordered the entire camp erased from the face of the earth. Every bunkhouse, the hospital, the power plant, the mess hall, the recreation hall, the stables, all of it pulled down, hauled off, burned or buried. The Bureau wanted no trace left behind, as though $250,000 and 440 enemy soldiers had never stood on the shore of Whitewater Lake at all. For decades afterward, the clearing was nothing but a quiet backcountry campsite, and only the sharpest-eyed visitor would ever notice the old foundations sinking under the moss, the scattered bricks, the rusted scraps of metal lost in the long grass. The camp had been deliberately, methodically forgotten. The men went home to a ruined and divided Germany. None were permitted to remain in Canada. That was the rule, and it held. And yet a striking number of them, having seen this enormous country at its strangest and its kindest, made their way back years later as free immigrants, to build new lives in the very land that had once stitched a red circle onto their backs and turned them loose in the woods. The fence the Canadians never built, had, in a way none of the planners ever intended, bound a few of these men to the country more tightly than any wire could have managed. Think about what that means. A wartime policy meant to extract cheap labor from defeated enemies, run on the cold logic of cordwood and cost per head, had quietly produced something no policy aims for and none can engineer: men who fell in love with the country that had imprisoned them. They had been brought across an ocean against their will, dressed in denim and marked with a target and handed an axe. And some of them spent the rest of their lives trying to get back. They remembered the open ground and the borrowed coats and the warm kitchens, the dances and the dugout canoes and the bear cub, and they decided that whatever else the war had been, this strange corner of Manitoba had shown them a way of treating a beaten enemy that was worth crossing the ocean a second time to live inside. The camp that was built to be forgotten had for a handful of men become the thing they could not forget. And the whole story might have stayed buried out there under the moss with the bricks, forgotten on purpose, just as the Parks Bureau intended, were it not for a single telephone call many years later. The historian Bill Weiser had written a book about the work camps in Canada's national parks. He called it Park Prisoners. On page 235, he told the story of the night of February 19th, 1944. The raid, the farmhouse, the jigsaw puzzle, the army officer in the doorway, the young schoolteacher caught in the middle of a war she had nothing to do with. One evening, his telephone rang, a woman's voice on the line, anxious, almost urgent, as if something were wrong. "Are you Bill Weiser?" she asked. "Author of Park Prisoners?" He said that he was. "Go get the book," she told him. He fetched it. She told him to turn to page 235. And then she said the thing he would never forget. "I'm the schoolteacher." Catherine Chasko, by then Catherine Dabrowski, a grandmother, had carried that one snowbound night with her for more than 50 years. The dance at Siege, the two cold men at the door, the puzzle in the lamplight, the hard knock and the lieutenant in the doorway, the tears, the blame that was never hers to carry, and the apology that came 2 weeks later in the shape of a ship in a bottle and a hand-carved box of chocolate. She had finally found a stranger who had written her story down in a book, and she wanted, at long last, to tell him her side of it. They met over coffee at an acreage outside Saskatoon, and she did. The red circle on the back, the blazed trees standing in for a fence, the compass made from a mail-order watch, the puzzle on the table at 10:30 on a snowing night. The whole strange, gentle, true story of the only prisoner of war camp in all of North America that was never surrounded by a single strand of wire, and of what the people inside it, and the people around it, quietly did with that opening. The men who designed Whitewater Lake believed the wilderness would make a better wall than wire, and in the narrowest possible sense they were proven right. Almost no one ran, because there was nowhere on earth to run to, but they had measured only the cold and the distance. They never thought to measure what would happen when you take a few hundred lonely young soldiers, set them down among a few hundred lonely settlers, and remove the one thing, the fence that was supposed to keep them strangers to one another. The wall they forgot to build was the only wall that would have truly worked, because the deepest truth of that camp was the one Willie Schneider understood standing in a warm farm kitchen, with a red circle hidden under a borrowed coat. A locked gate keeps a man's body in one place, but it is an open one that forces him to decide every single night what kind of man he is going to be. So here is the question we will leave you with. If you had been a guard at a camp with no fence, watching enemy soldiers walk out into the dark each night and walk back in each morning, men who danced with your neighbors and brought sugar to your weddings and fixed your schoolteacher's broken clock, would you have raided that farmhouse in the snow and broken it all up? Or would you have looked the other way and let the puzzle get finished? There is a real argument on both sides, and we read every comment. Tell us where you land. And if you want more forgotten true stories from the Second World War, the quiet mercies, the impossible decisions, and the stubborn humanity that survived in the most unlikely corners of the war, subscribe and stay with us. The next one is already being pulled out of the archives.